Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the American Center for Physics and to the AIP Lyne Trimble lecture this evening. I'm Michael Maloney. I'm the CEO of the American Institute of Physics, and I am delighted to welcome you here in the room and to our virtual audience to this evening's lecture. And particularly delighted to welcome real live three-dimensional bodies to this room that has been mostly empty for the last 2.5 years. And certainly this is the first of the Trimble lecture series we've had in person for, I guess it's probably nearly 3 years probably at this point. So it's really great to see everybody here tonight and to make the effort to come out. And I'm also glad we had it tonight and not last night, because if you were here last night, there would be no power and there was flooding in the parking lot. So really want to say thank you to the whole team here at ACP for turning the building around and making sure we had power and light and air conditioning and all that today. So I thank them on your behalf. So it's also great to welcome you here at a really exciting moment in AIP's history as we move towards our 100th anniversary in 2031. We just celebrated 90 years of our founding last year. And we're in the midst of a strategic transformation here at AIP, one that our team have been collectively working on since we adopted a new strategic framework back in 2019. And it's a transformation that will put us in an even stronger position to deliver on our mission to advance the physical sciences and for the benefit of humanity, to really strengthen our position to advance that mission even better as we move forward. From the beginning, that effort of transformation has included taking a hard look at ourselves as an organization, the way we work, what we do, the products we produce and such. And the pandemic has only really brought into tighter focus the need for us to pay serious attention to the way that we work together as a team, which has changed significantly over the last 3 years, but also how we envision serving the needs of the stakeholder communities that we serve as a federation of 10 member societies and as an institute that conducts research and analysis to really advance our knowledge of the physical sciences. And so in our strategic framework, the reason why I'm mentioning it here tonight is one of the important objectives there is, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, is to establish innovative approaches to both preserving and advancing the study of the history of the physical sciences so that we can better forecast the trajectory of our future as an enterprise. And so that's really important as we think about the role that history plays in AIP's mission. For us as an organization, the Center for History of Physics and the Niels Bohr Library and Archives are a critical part of our strategic transformation. They have been, are, and will be a central part of who we are as an organization and how we meet our mission. Next month, the Niels Bohr Library and Archives will celebrate its 60th anniversary of its founding. And 30 years ago, the library moved along with the rest of AIP and our sister organizations here at ACP into this building. We were originally in New York City before that, but this building was actually designed with the library and the need for maintaining our archives as a central part of the design. And the big box that you came in under as you walked into the building is the core of the whole library infrastructure. We're just finishing a $1 million installation of a state-of-the-art climate control. I was talking to Melanie about this, climate control vault within the building to house our rare book collection, a collection that we've been able to really develop and I describe very honestly as a national treasure. We've been able to build out this vault to be able to maintain and curate and protect that treasure going forward. So because of the importance of the history programs, I also wanted to recognize that in the last year, the board of directors and I have tasked a blue ribbon panel to help us form a strategic vision for how the library, archives, and the history programs can really best meet the needs of our stakeholders and advance our strategy. We've got many of the members of that panel here tonight, and so I want to say a special welcome to those of you that are here, because they're meeting tomorrow here in person as a sort of anchor meeting of their effort over the last few months and the months ahead to help us provide that strategic vision for our history programs. And I know I and David Helfand, who's chair of our board of directors, who's here this evening and will be meeting with the panel tomorrow, are really looking forward to learning from the wisdom of their deliberations over the months ahead. So our speaker tonight, I don't want to steal the thunder from Melanie, who's going to be introducing our speaker, but Hanne Andersen, who's joining us this evening from Copenhagen, which is obviously the birthplace of Niels Bohr himself. And there's also a Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen as well that we have very close relations with. I'm delighted that Hanne's joining us this evening, and also particularly delighted that she's a key member of the panel, the Blue Ribbon panel, that's helping us envision the future of these really important activities. So another core capability, obviously, of the work we do in the history and library and archives are the people who make it all happen. And so I'm delighted to introduce Melanie Muller, who's director of the Niels Bohr Library and Archives, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight. So thank you very much, everybody. And I really hope you enjoy, whether you're here in the room or virtually, that you enjoyed tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. I'm Melanie Mueller, and I'm the director of the Niels Bohr Library and Archives, and I'm also the interim director of the Center for History of Physics. And I'll second Michael's remarks that it is so great to be here in person and see actual people in the American Center for Physics. It just feels familiar and new all at the same time. And as an archivist and as a librarian, if you know archivists and librarians in your life, we can often be an introverted crew. And so for hearing me say that I'm glad to see people and work amongst people is just an amazing thing. Michael mentioned that we do have an in-person audience and a virtual audience. So I do have a few reminders for the virtual audience. You are all in listen-only mode. You can ask questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. For closed captions, you can click the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you do experience technical difficulties, please use the chat feature in Zoom. And a reminder for all audiences, today's lecture is being recorded and a link will be posted to the Trimble lecture webpage. And now, without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker, Hanne Andersen. Dr. Andersen is a historian and philosopher of science in the Department of Science Education at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Her research examines science as it is practiced, utilizing historical and contemporary case studies with analytical tools drawn from general philosophy of science, social epistemology, and research ethics. She is particularly interested in making the history, philosophy, and sociology of science relevant to researchers and educators, as well as to academic leaders and policymakers. Dr. Andersen was elected a member of the European Academy of Science in 2018, a corresponding member of the International Academy for Philosophy of Science in 2019. She is active in multiple societies, including the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Philosophy of Science Association, the European Philosophy of Science Association, and the Society for the Philosophy of Science and Practice. She also serves as a member of the Danish Committee on Research Misconduct and has been a valued member of the AIP Blue Ribbon panel on the history programs, which Michael just mentioned. That's it for my introduction. And following the lecture, Will Thomas, who is the Senior Science Policy Analyst at FYI Science Policy News, will open the floor for questions from both the in-person and virtual audience. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hanne Andersen.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak in this our series of Trimble lectures here at the American Institute of Physics. Thank you to the audience present. I join in really being happy to do something together with other people in 3 dimensions. This is my first international trip since the pandemic started, so it's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you also to the online audience for joining us virtually. I think if one good thing has come out of the pandemic, it is definitely that we can do that kind of mixed events where people can join us virtually as well as physically. In my talk on the structure and development of 21st century science, or a talk to which I have added the title Tensions and Balances, or as a good academic, of course, I have made such last minute changes compared to what I wrote in the abstract. I shall return to a topic that was very popular with historically inclined philosophers of science half a century ago, namely the structural conditions for science to progress over time. One of the key contributors to this literature makes me especially happy to speak here today, namely Thomas Kuhn, a physicist turned philosopher who is among the creators of the Sources for History of Quantum Physics collection that was created in the 1960s and can be found here or in the Niels Bohr Library and Archives, as well as at the Niels Bohr Archive in Copenhagen, or at the University of Copenhagen, my home institution, where Kuhn and his collaborators placed their European headquarters while collecting material and conducting interviews. So the close connection between the institutions has been there for a long time, and I hope that it will thrive for a long time in the future. However, the work by Kuhn that I will allude to today is not this work on the history of quantum physics, but instead his work on the development of science in general. We are a mixed audience today, so although many here will be deeply familiar with Kuhn's work, to make sure that we are all on the same page, or for the latter part of the talk, when I go into the analysis, I shall first briefly reiterate some of the main points that serve as starting points for later analysis of 21st century science. Summarized very, very briefly, Kuhn described scientific progress as the development that takes place within specialized fields within which research is conducted by a community of researchers, where all researchers have been trained to share a set of received beliefs, what he called a paradigm, and through this training, they have acquired equivalent abilities to identify new research problems that others in the community will also see as relevant, and they have acquired equivalent abilities to assess whether a solution will be received in the community as acceptable. On this basis, the researchers in the community pursue the various puzzles that the reigning paradigm defines, and by conscientiously and truthfully drawing on the shared set of beliefs, and by continuously keeping track also of what others have produced within the community, it's clear to them which problems have been solved, which problems still need to be solved, and which new problems are becoming apparent as they go. On the one hand, working faithfully within the paradigm enables them to move faster and penetrate deeper, as Kuhn stated it, than if they kept spending time examining all sorts of alternatives. But on the other side, this stable, focused effort to investigate in detail each question that a paradigm presents at the same time ensures that it will eventually be discovered where the paradigm has limitations. This is what Kuhn described as an essential tension between tradition and innovation, or between convergent and divergent thought. The ultimate effect of tradition-bound work is to change the tradition itself. But this process of changing the tradition has a particular structure. When recalcitrant problems are discovered, the previous consensus in the community on what the relevant problems look like, which tools to use to solve them, and what an acceptable solution looks like, may dissolve. And different members of the scientific community may try out different modifications or replacements of the received beliefs. This distribution of conservative and innovative dispositions among members of the community ensures a spreading of risk in the scientific community that is crucial. If no one reacted to problems in a high-risk way, there would be no possibility of change. Vice versa, if everybody reacted to each little deviation by suggesting radical changes, science would become a mess. So this risk spreading is essential for the Kuhnian model of scientific progress. Kuhn's monograph, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that was published back in 1962, still stands as one of the most important, although also controversial, books in philosophy of science from the 20th century. Impressively, for a book in philosophy of science, Structure has sold more than 1 million copies. And during the 6 decades that have passed since the publication of Structure, it has had a significant influence, not only in history, philosophy, and sociology of science, an influence that some practitioners have found for the better or for the worse, but its influence has spanned much broader than that. Structure has been read by many, many scientists, science educators, science managers, and policymakers. And through this route, it has contributed to shaping how we think about science and its development as we moved out of the 20th and into the 21st century. Granting agencies, for example, have taken to heart the idea of revolutions. Of course, what to fund is a big leaps forward. Or if you look, for example, at the National Science Foundation, there are special programs for transformative research. The way they define it is that it's radical change in the understanding of an important existing concept in science and lead to the creation of a new paradigm or field of science. So definitely there's part of this analysis that has been part of shaping how we deal with science also on a policy level. But there's also a number of assumptions underlying this analysis of how science progresses over time that may be historically contingent and which may therefore prompt us to revisit the analysis and the lessons that we draw from it. First, the effectiveness of normal science in identifying and solving all the problems that a paradigm defines depends on community members being able to first effectively keep track of the development in their field. Second, largely trust what other community members have found without having to carry out the same work themselves in its entirety. So it builds an open communication within a manageable volume of responsible researchers. Second, the effectiveness in locating loci of trouble depends on community members being first able to pursue every minor detail, leaving no stone unturned. And second, being meticulous in assessing new results, their own as well as the results of others. And third, being in a position to raise questions and voice concern. Finally, the risk spreading mechanism depends on the individual community members being free to pursue alternative directions, even at a point where others do not necessarily find it so promising. So it depends on some form of freedom of research. And that brings me now, finally, to the title and the approach to the 21st century. Kuhn and others with him analyzed the situation of scientists who were working individually within disciplinary boundaries, who were able to keep track of the development of their specialty, all actively participating in an organized skepticism anchored in the community, while being free to pursue the ideas that they found most fruitful and expected to do so with integrity. But since then, science has increased in volume. It's become more collaborative, more interdisciplinary, more dependent on funding and considerations about usefulness, and more frequently haunted by questionable practices. How do these structural changes affect the way in which science develops? This is obviously a question that is larger than what can be covered in a single talk, and I shall focus here primarily on collaboration and interdisciplinarity. It's also a topic that involves many different disciplines, And I shall therefore draw on history of science, philosophy of science, and sociology of science as I proceed. I shall start with collaboration. As I said, while Kuhn's historical studies were focused on individual sciences, science today has become increasingly collaborative. With some minor variations between disciplines, it has been documented across all scientific disciplines that more and more research is conducted in groups. What you see here is a figure from a paper from 2007 published in Science, where it's shown from studies of our publications in Web of Science, how the percentage of papers published by groups have increased from about 50% in 1960 to about 80% in the year 2000 for the sciences, less for the social sciences, and much less for the humanities. To the right, you see the increase in our team mean size from a little below 2 around 1960 to 3.5 in the year 2000. Similarly, while Kuhn's historical studies focused on scientists working within disciplinary boundaries, science today has become increasingly interdisciplinary. Various methodologies have been used to document this development. Some studies show an increasing prevalence of co-authors with different disciplinary affiliation. Some studies show increasing assignment of keywords from different disciplines, and some studies show increase in citation across disciplinary boundaries. This is such a map of science drawn from citations. In some of my previous publications, I have argued that if we investigate these developments as a spectrum in 2 dimensions that range from the disciplinary to the interdisciplinary, from disciplinary where we have a convergence in the cognitive resources we're using, to interdisciplinarity where we draw different cognitive resources together. And the other dimension are from the individual to the collaborative, with individual scientists being largely epistemic independent and collaborative scientists being epistemically dependent on each other. By analyzing scientific activities in such a spectrum, we can talk about 4 different ideal types of research activities. First, the traditional view, the traditional ideal of scientists brought up in the same tradition to act as independent and autonomous agents who are individually accountable for their research and together provide a community-based quality control of new results. Second, the tendency to disciplinize interdisciplinary research by creating new programs that train the next generation of scientists to master all the various cognitive resources involved in this interdisciplinary research field. That seems to be a strategy that serves to make these new practitioners in the interdisciplinary field epistemically autonomous, like in the traditional legend, so that they can be individually accountable for their research, and so then there can also be a community-based quality control. So in a way, it's trying to bring interdisciplinary research back to the traditional legend by producing what I have here called omniscient interdisciplinarians. But most contemporary research contrasts to this individualized picture. Scientists today collaborate. They collaborate to do more better work than they could have performed if they worked individually by dividing labor among them. Collaborative activities therefore imply epistemic dependence or among collaborators, the right side of the spectrum. That holds whether it's a disciplinary division of labor between scientists who share the same cognitive resources and just divide similar pieces of labor among them because none of them could overcome it all alone, or whether it's an interdisciplinary division of labor between scientists from different disciplines who collaborate in order to combine different cognitive resources that are distributed among them and which they do not all possess individually. Because scientists to the right side defer to each other as part of the research process. They're no longer individually fully accountable for the produced results. And further, if they collaborate across disciplinary boundaries, there's no well-defined community to provide the quality control. The traditional legend has traditionally told us that it's only in traditional monodisciplinary activities that we have both individual accountability and community-based quality control. And this legend is a basis for much contemporary concern that either collaboration and interdisciplinarity is not up to standards, or it's particularly hard and challenging. And elsewhere, I have argued that changing review practices towards more collaborative formats would be one way of rethinking quality control for collaborative interdisciplinary research, and that being more transparent about calibration of trust between collaborators is one way of rethinking accountability in order to figure more prominently in the way we teach research integrity and responsible conduct of research. Hence, these are ways in which results from history and philosophy, sociology of science can feed back into science as it is practiced today. And I shall here say a little bit more about the latter, our accountability and rethinking our training in research integrity. Because as the prevalence of collaboration has increased, debates on credit and accountability for collaborative research has intensified. Here's just a selection of various papers or from Science, Nature, some of the big biomedical journals, where people have discussed over decades, or for collaborative research or co-authored papers, who is actually accountable, who is the author, what are all the problems that arise, and various suggestions have been made in how to deal with accountability and responsibility for co-authored papers. Some of this debate has been spurred also by high-profile cases of misconduct, where investigative committees have expressed doubt about how to understand responsibility in a group context and whether co-authors to such papers bear some kind of responsibility, or if the blame is only on the one individual who have done something fraudulent. From analysis of such historical cases of scientific misconduct, what I have argued is that as a complement to traditional training in research integrity that is focused on the individual, much of this training is rule-based or focused on telling people all the things that they're not allowed to do individually, but it's not very much focused on how is it that you collaborate with others, and how is it that you, as a collaborator, react when you start having the first feelings that maybe there's something here that is odd, that's not quite right, or that's usually not what that kind of training is about. It's about, once you see that here's a problem that is so big that I want to report it, there's a lot about how to report it, but how to interact with each other in the group setting and how to react from the first warning signs is often not covered in that kind of training. So what I suggest that we need a complement. We need to provide training also on how to interact responsibly in groups. And more specifically, in drawing here in resources from socioepistemology, particularly the analysis of trust in science provided by the philosopher Hartwig, I have argued that trust between collaborators need to be calibrated by establishing reasons to believe that our collaborators are indeed competent, conscientious, has adequate epistemic self-assessment, what is called epistemic character, and acts truthfully, moral character. This kind of calibration is a standard in a mentoring relationship. The supervisor will have that kind of thoughts, at least for the epistemic side, while supervising. Or the truthfulness is more something that we tend to assume, and where we have difficulties when it is that we start doubting. And between equal collaborators, we don't talk that much about how it is that we calibrate trust in epistemic character. However, failure to perform this calibration can be seen as an epistemic failure, much like the failure to calibrate an instrument, probably. That also means that it's, as I said, an epistemic failure. It's not a moral failure. And that can be a route to understanding some of the problems that some of the communities have had when they've had to assess whether to put blame on co-authors. There's an epistemic failure, perhaps, in not having calibrated their trust early on in a collaborator, but it's not a moral failure of the same sort, or that the one who has actually committed the fraudulent actions has committed. So I think this is one area where the way in which science has changed should prompt us to change certain practices. We need here additional kinds of integrity training. Another implication from the increasing collaborative and interdisciplinary character of contemporary science is linked to what I call the granularity of research activities. Science has not only become increasingly collaborative in the sense that more and more research is produced in groups, on average, the size of the groups has also steadily increased. The figure I showed before showed how the group mean size has increased primarily at the sciences, but also in the social sciences. And this figure from a report from the National Academy of Sciences show how in the 1960s, most papers are in science had 1 to 2 authors. That's the blue and the brown reddish line. Whereas today, most papers have 6 to 10 authors. That's the red line that starts out in the bottom of the colored lines and end up in 2013 or something at the top. The figure also includes papers with many more authors, including those with more than 100 and more than 1,000. And you can see that those have also been on the rise. There's a lot of work done in both history and philosophy of science and large-scale collaborations. That's not my concern here. My concern is really with the up to 10 or something, or teams, which is still the dominant type. What we see in studies like this is a gradual change in the granularity of the scientific community, the way in which the efforts of scientists is distributed within the community. Scientists do no longer primarily work alone, as was the case for most of the examples, a Kuhn-drawn structure, what could be represented here in idealized form. To the left, there are small dots for each scientist. Instead, they increasingly work in small to medium-sized teams, although there are still also people who work alone, represented here in an idealized form to the right, with some small dots or single scientists and groups where people work together. Intuitively, it may be expected that risk can more easily be distributed in the situation to the left compared to the situation to the right. And empirical studies do exist that vindicate this intuition. Scientometric studies, based again on the records in Web of Science, have come to the conclusion, based on investigating our citation patterns, that, and I quote here from a title in a paper from 2019 published in Nature, large teams develop and small teams disrupt science and technology. And maybe not surprisingly, surveys among scientists have shown that scientists in general would like to see a change in funding patterns away from focusing on a few large grants and instead disseminating funding more broadly by providing many small grants. Nevertheless, there are currently many funding schemes that favor large-scale funding for collaboration. Many such collaborations are organized in a way that some who study our team science call rockets. The picture here is adapted from a textbook in research leadership that is used on my own university to train the next generation of group leaders and heads of sections. It depicts a rocket-shaped organization with a single or just a few PI at the tip of the rocket, an intermediate layer of postdocs, and a huge fuel tank of PhD students whose work is the real energy that drives the record forward in the direction set by the PI. Such a rocket-shaped organization is generally extremely efficient in producing impressive amounts of research within a particular area defined by the PI. It's usually also very efficient in making the top PI gain prominence, whereas the juniors can sometimes not, be seen almost as a consumable. But how does this affect science ability to identify loci of trouble and investigate alternatives when necessary? That is, what does such an organization imply for the ability to critically scrutinize results, leaving no stone unturned, and for the ability for all involved to raise questions, voice concerns, and to have freedom to pursue alternative directions? Is it a given that large teams develop and small teams disrupt science, so that we ought to change funding practices away from funding large teams? Or should we look into the inner working of large teams and see whether they can be improved so that they can both develop and disrupt science? To investigate that, we need to look more closely into the inner working of such rockets. And here, history and philosophy of science can join forces with sociology of science and the field that is called science of team science. Obviously, the inner working of groups, such rockets, can be of different kinds. One framework for thinking about this has been developed by the sociologists of science, Rossini and Porter, already back in the late 1970s, where they introduced the distinction between what they call common group learning, negotiation among experts, and integration by leader. In common group learning, there is an intensive interaction between all group members so that they all end up knowing the same, having the same information, and decisions and conclusions can be drawn more or less by consensus. If they're all rational people, they have the same knowledge, they ought to draw the same conclusions. As a side remark, this is often what we require of students when they do collaborative work, but it's not necessarily what we do in research. So as a side topic, we may also ask if we actually train students the right way for working collaboratively, but that's not a topic I will pursue here. In negotiation between experts, there's interaction between group members with different expertise where their various contributions interact. So it's not as intense. It's less labor intensive. Group members do not end up being all experts in everything, like in common group learning. But it's not given from the outset how joint conclusions are drawn and by whom. There's a lot of work in social epistemology over the last decades that focuses on problems like this. And in integration by leader, the PI acquires input from all group members and synthesizes findings. Here it's transparent by whom conclusions are drawn, although the process through which it happens may still vary. To understand that process in more detail, it may be helpful to look at another framework developed by Bozeman and Uti and described in detail in their recent monograph, Strength in Numbers. They have interviewed scientists on their experiences with collaboration management. On that basis, they had described 5 archetypes. Tyrannical collaboration management, where the PI makes all decisions and is largely uninterested in collaborators' values and preferences and show little respect for it. Directive, where the PI makes all decisions, but not in a malevolent way like the tyrannical. What they call pseudo-consultative. The PI actually consults with collaborators, but some more than others. Assumptive, where the PI assumes what collaborators' values and preferences are, but maybe wrong. And consultative collaboration management, where all parties of the collaboration are consulted at key points in order to identify values and preferences and to decide upon actions. Their estimate is that 10 to 20% of research collaborations are tyrannical, 20 to 30% directive, 5 to 10% pseudo-consultative, about half assumptive, and 5 to 10% consultative. But at the same time, they argue that consultative collaboration management in general is the most effective approach. A lot of their concern is with issues such as work style fit, inclusiveness, avoiding conflicts, etc., which is all very important, but not necessarily the same epistemic concern that I have as a philosopher of science. But it also seems that their characterization of consultative collaboration fits remarkably well with the epistemic conditions for science to be able to be both puzzle solving and identifying loci of trouble. Part of what they describe for consultative collaboration is that there's whole team communication rather than communication among subgroups only. So this open communication where everybody knows what is going on. There's a high level of trust among collaborators. Assessment of ideas is not related to status of the presenting individual. So there's this freedom to voice concerns no matter who you are or where you're placed in the rocket. There's a possibility of disagreement, and that disagreement can be made transparent. And there's a recognition of diverse values and objectives. Most of the conditions that come out of the Kuhnian analysis of what it takes for science to be able to both solve puzzles and identify loci of trouble. So it seems that what is good for science as a workplace is actually also good for scientific progress. Now, this talk is presenting work in progress, and I would love to hear from historians of science who have worked in groups whether these categories provided by sociologist studies of contemporary groups resonates with historical cases, and if they share the estimates I just mentioned on the prevalence of the various types. And I do see here a potential for historical work to serve as important inspiration in the training of future research leaders. And before I wrap up with some further reflections on the usefulness of history, philosophy, and sociology of science, or for the sciences themselves, let me first briefly summarize the points that I've been arguing for so far. Kuhn produced a very neat and elegant argument about the essential tension that drives scientific progress, and for example, funding agencies have taken this analysis to heart. But as science has developed towards more collaboration, more interdisciplinarity, higher volume of activity, larger groups, higher dependence on funding, more consideration of use, this analysis needs to be modified. And here I have focused primarily on the implications of collaboration, interdisciplinarity, and group size, and argued that more collaboration requires explicit practices for calibrating trust among collaborators, and therefore also new formats for integrity training focused on that. That more interdisciplinarity requires new practices for assessment and quality control, and for example, more collaborative review practices. And that the increasing granularity requires explicit practices for research leadership, and therefore also new formats for leadership training. Some areas perhaps not just new formats of leadership training, but leadership training as such. My own institution, it's relatively recent that we've done that. As I said in the beginning of this talk, my work is a return to topics that were popular half a century ago. At this time, history of science, philosophy of science, sociology of science, culture of science were in various stages of their infancy or early childhood. But they were seen as disciplines that were expected to be of value for science and for science education. For example, in the 1955 conference on the history, philosophy, and sociology of science, sponsored by the National Science Foundation, with the aim of investigating the value of these disciplines for science and for education. In the publications that came out of that, it was argued that scientists tend to become technicians who have no vision of larger relationships, and the only way to overcome these limitations is to provide philosophical and historical perspectives on contemporary research. Teaching could be enlivened and made more meaningful by presenting the technical material in a philosophical and historical setting. Sociology of science has values for science in making clear the social and cultural circumstances which make for scientific progress. And the three fields offer potential values to science and to education, which should be brought to a higher degree of realization. However, as these disciplines have developed and professionalized in the meantime and been supplemented with many additional fields such as scientometrics, science of team science, psychology of science, economics of science, they have, and now I'm being provocative, by exaggerating, perhaps had a tendency to close in on themselves, to become increasingly myopic in their attention to individual cases and their many contingent details, and less interested in large-scale pictures. And although I'm being provocative, I'm not the only one who has noted and lamented the demise of large-scale pictures. A focus section in ISIS some years ago also explicitly called for a return to studies of the durée longue. Vice versa, given the massive increase in detailed knowledge about the way in which science is structured, carried out, develops, it may seem daring today to attempt to produce large-scale accounts like what Kuhn was doing when he developed his phase model and his analysis of the essential tension between convergent and divergent thought. But at the same time, I do think that there's still need for this kind of analysis. I think that kind of analysis is required today in order to qualify science policy, since that continues to work from large-scale ideas about how science is structured, carried out, what should be done to advance its development, whether or not historians, philosophers, sociologists, and other scholars analyzing science address these large-scale issues. It's through analysis like this one, or like this, that we can also learn from problems that science has encountered. And that also means investigating the history of developments that we do not celebrate, that we do not commemorate. That kind of historical investigation is also extremely important for understanding science and for providing knowledge that we can use to improve science in the future. And now I want to say thank you for your attention, and thank you to the Danish Carlsberg Foundation that has granted me a year's research time to work on a book manuscript on the structure and development of 21st century science. I've just started this work, so I'll be very happy for any feedback and suggestions. Thank you.
Hanne, thank you very much for that talk. I'll move around the room and take questions. As a reminder for our virtual audience, you can submit questions for the speaker by the Q&A function. The chat function is reserved for technical difficulties. Fred, let's start with you.
Hanne, thank you for the wonderful talk. I want you to cycle back earlier in the talk when you were talking about fraudulent science, or let's enlarge it to scientific retractions that may not have been involved with fraud. It seems the way even science media, let alone the mainstream media, treats retractions of any type is sensationalized. And if you look at, for example, there's an organization called retraction.org that keeps track of articles, scholarly articles that are retracted for any reason. In a typical year, it's a few hundred. We publish over 2 million articles a year. So that's a very small fraction. I've never calculated what the error rate is in a fine publication like the New York Times, but it's probably a few percent a week, okay, of errors that they have propagated. Now, both the scientific press, Science and Nature News, and general media make a lot of hay about scientific fraud or scientific mistakes, totally ignoring the size of the problem. So to me, and this is what my question is to you, I think the real problem is explaining how science works to the public, that the error rate is actually how science works. It's self-correcting. And that we ought to be, when we describe a problem in science, we ought to say it's being corrected. So I'd be interested in how you're handling this problem.
I agree to very, very much of what you say. I agree completely that the problem is not as huge as it is often represented in the media. It's actually not huge at all. You're absolutely right that many, many articles are produced and very, very few have problems. However, I think what history also shows is that it's dangerous to assume that science is self-correcting. I think the history of how we have come to talk about misconduct and integrity is largely a US history that started in the 1980s, and the congressional hearings that also showed that some of these cases, it took a very, very long time to really get them resolved. So I think it's where I do not quite agree is to expect science to be self-correcting. There have been cases where the self-correcting didn't work, and which or took too long. Exactly. So I do think that we do need procedures for it. I also think that we do need the kind of training that we provide. We don't know whether the cases we see, in how far it's a tip of the iceberg, or there's some controversy on how many papers are actually never cited or never read, but whether it's a large proportion or an intermediate proportion, there may be results out there. You can say, does it matter if they are not read anyhow? But it may matter in other ways, in derived ways of who get careers, who get to train the next generation, etc. So I do think that it's for good reason that we provide training. And I think that we can improve that training by talking more about how is it that we work together in a group, and how is it that collaborators trust each other. In those big cases we have had who has gotten the media attention, some of those, it has also taken too long before the group reacted because they didn't have the calibration practices in place. And I think if that can help us to actually catch those cases before they turn into big problems, then we've done a really good thing for science.
Thanks for the lovely talk. I'd like to ask a question about your characterization of collaborative communities that you showed. It wasn't your work, but other people's work you're referring to. In the paradigm shifting times that I've been part of, one of the major driving forces was the interaction between different groups, which often takes the form of criticism, competition, amplification. And there's a very exciting time in which groups that are well identified and separate from one another are producing and hitting back and forth ideas that are developing and changing very rapidly. How does that fit into your categorization?
I mean, the relation between groups, all the competition and mutual criticism, etc., I see as, I mean, that can be seen as equivalent to the old picture of the competition and criticism, etc., that goes on between individuals. I think where we need to revisit our picture of science is when we look into the inner structure of the teams. If we get more and more intermediate size teams with a top PI and a group of juniors, do we also have that kind of inner working where people are trained to that kind of criticism? Or do we get too many groups where hierarchical structures may interfere with training and may interfere with the capacity to find problems when find recalcitrant or problems. I think there are some studies that indicate there are junior scholars for whom it's difficult or to express to their PI that things doesn't work the way it ought to work. And also some studies indicate that some cases of misconduct actually start out with juniors who really just want to please their PI and I'm not really sure about how it is that they're working with this. That doesn't fit the picture they're supposed to deliver, and that's the first step towards our not our performing practices with the integrity that you're supposed to. So it's very much the inner working of the group that is my concern here, and their concern.
Let's take a question from the online audience, and then I'll come back over to the side of the room.
One of our virtual audience members says, "Thanks for your enlightening lecture. Do you consider in your theoretical frame some approach to research of academic research from authors like Bourdieu in their Homo Academicus? Again, thanks for your lecture."
Definitely, a scholar like Bourdieu is extremely important for thinking about our academic fields, or how people in an academic field relate to each other. And I think that would simply add another dimension to the analysis that I have provided. That's a dimension that I would like to explore. It's not a dimension that I have explored in detail so far. And opening up for that now would take over the entire Q&A. I'm very happy for that question, and it's a direction that I would really like to pursue.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful talk. I had a question. Has the rate of misconduct or fraud increased as science has gone from more individual to collaborative? And if so, in your opinion, are you able to kind of pick something that you think has contributed most to that increased rate out of everything that you mentioned in this talk?
I think it's actually methodologically difficult to find out whether the rate has increased or numbers are small, and we do not know whether we see the tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot of uncertainty in comparing across time. There are some who claim that it's on the rise. There are some who have theoretical arguments, or that funding pressure, or increasing competition on positions, on grants, or pushes in that direction. But I do not think that we have empirical studies that really shows that theoretical argument also holds. I mean, it sounds plausible, but I haven't seen the studies that really show that this is what has driven those people who have conducted misconduct. They may be out there, and I just not found them yet.
I am struck by the fact that you hardly mentioned developments in technology changing the nature of science. And another thing that I find is that the scale on which science is conducted has got bigger and bigger and bigger. So now, in fact, funding is not necessarily even national anymore, it's international. And those international structures bring with them international politics as well. So science gets very much more complicated than just the interaction of individual scientists with other scientists. And so I'd like to hear your comments about that.
I agree completely. And I think at some point I said, of course, my title is much too huge a topic to really cover in one talk, and therefore I had to make some selection. And clearly our technology is also a very important issue for how science has developed over the last 50 years or more, for that matter. And also changes in funding pattern, you're right, or there's more international funding. There's also another change in funding patterns that are, at least in some settings, become very important. In my own home country, for example, funding has shifted from being largely state funding to now about 50% private funding, but private funding without full overhead. So that kind of funding actually draws resources out of the universities and it gives a lot of funding to those people who receive it, but at the same time, it draws resources away from those who have not received grants. So one group of researchers get more and more freedom of research, and another group of researchers get less and less freedom of research. And I think that is also something that affects science structurally, or which I haven't covered here, but which is on my to-do list for the next year.
This is a wonderful discussion. I'm afraid we're only going to have time for one more question.
Oh, I have 17 questions, but I guess I'll have to stick with one. Certainly one starts with the nature of the creature, which includes our biology, everything, we are a particular kind of primate. Our 3 pounds of wetware work in a certain way. We can now assess that, and we're now adding to it. So, you read in the news, for example, that the people who work in biology and biophysics and biochemistry and so forth have come up with the structures of proteins. Now it's literally true that artificial intelligence can go way beyond structuring all the proteins that are in the proteomes that create us and are maybe creating us in the future. So, but the question is this. So I want to start with us. There's a new religion, and that's a word you should probably, religion or faith. The new religion, which is being preached a lot around here, like where we're located. Think about DARPA, for example. Disruption. It's the church of disruption. Come in, I've gone to engineering seminars and so forth, where the basic philosophy is come in and just rip things up and throw it against the wall and disrupt everything. How do you understand disruption in this new paradigm?
I mean, I come from the Kuhnian angle, so I understand it very much, or in the way of scientific revolutions, but at the same time, how Kuhn described it was, although Kuhn enlarged or the amount of phenomena you could describe under the concept of scientific revolutions, or I would probably enlarge it further and say that we have small-scale revolutions within disciplines that do not necessarily affect overall worldviews like the Copernican revolution, etc., but which has some of the same characteristics as are Kuhn described for revolutions, or communication difficulties, or a certain or discontinuity in the development. So that's how I understand disruption. I'm not absolutely sure about the phenomena you're referring to. So I may not be well equipped to describe the difference, but I hope that I have done something helpful in describing how it is that I understand disruption.
Okay, well, thank you all for your questions and for coming to this Trimble lecture with Dr. Hanne Andersen. This lecture has been recorded and will be available for viewing on the AIP History Program's YouTube channel. For update on future Trimble lectures, you can follow the Center for History of Physics on Twitter and subscribe to the email list on our website. The Niels Bohr Library and Archives and the Center for History of Physics have many exciting things coming this fall. Stay tuned every Thursday for new episodes of Initial Conditions, a physics history podcast available wherever you get your podcasts. The next Trimble lecture will be given on September 21st by Dr. Maria Rentetzi, entitled Radiating the World, the History of Radiation Protection and the Role of the IAEA. We hope that you'll join us then. Thank you very much. I hope you'll all give a round of applause for our speaker this evening, Dr. Hanne Andersen.